Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Judy Brown. I'm one of the directors of Governance Junction. And for our final beginner series, Derek is going to be talking to us about conflicts of interest on the boards. This to me is the most controversial of sections because people do regard not conflicts of interest as a bad thing. And Derek is going to tell us all about it. Thank you kindly.
Thanks, Judy. Hello, everybody. Just going to share my screen here and get going. Okay. All right, conflicts of interest. And this is wrapping up 2023 for Governance Junction in our series. We've got a whole new batch coming next year for you. Hope you've enjoyed these ones. Yeah, as Judy said, this is a common one, comes up all the time. And, there's, I guess, this overwhelming question that conflict of interest are bad, right? So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about, is that necessarily the case? They are everywhere, though. Particularly in not-for-profits, conflicts of interest are everywhere. It's hard to find a not-for-profit charity that at some point, somewhere, there is not existing a conflict of interest. It's the nature of the beast. It's the nature of these organisations that bring community people together, rely heavily on relationships to structure boards and get assistance, in terms of getting things done, of knowing people that can help in this area and help in that area and such. And so it's somewhat, maybe I'm a bit of a leap here, but I'm saying it's probably somewhat the norm in charities and not-for-profits. And this comes, again, we pose these things in questions, and Judy and I have had, people come to us all the time and say, oh, I've got the conflict of interest. How do we manage it? Where do we start? Or the other end of the scale, they're a bit flippant about it. Oh, yeah, I think there's a bit of a conflict of interest, but it was all right. We got through it, or the board was okay with it, or whatever it may be. So it is a common area. And I think what we hope to do today in this webinar is help you manage these things, identify them and manage them. So let's go back to our last webinar where we talked about director duties. I'm not going to go through all that again, but we are going to talk about, the specific duties on directors and committee members of the duty of loyalty and good faith. And essentially, just as a reminder, directors must always act in the best interest of the company or the association. That interest must come first. That is the company or association. Interest must come first. And it must be on behalf of the members as a whole. That's an important point. Not in the interest of a particular member, but of the members of the whole of the members. Okay, that's an important point. Okay. In completing this duties, directors must act for proper purpose. And I'm going to read these two orange points out. Not improperly use their position to gain an advantage for themselves or someone else, or to cause detriment to the organisation. Secondly, not improperly use information to gain an advantage for themselves or someone else, or to cause detriment of the organisation. Okay. Directors must not place themselves in an actual or potential material conflict of interest. Okay, so if you're about to make a decision and you know that by making that decision, I'm going to be in conflict, then you've got to declare that. And the common one is where you are on a board and you've been asked to step onto another board, and there may be some connection between those two boards. Maybe they're competitors, maybe one is a service provider to the other, or whatever. And in you making that decision to go on that second board may potentially raise this issue. So you have to consider it in terms of, I have an actual conflict of interest now, or potentially could have one in the future. We have to be concerned about both of those. So they're bad, right? We've still got this question we started with at the start of this webinar. They're bad. Well, they're not necessarily bad things. In fact, they're everywhere. Okay. Certainly some conflicts of interest are criminal, but they're often slide under the radar, those types. They're not openly discussed, or, they're not declared. People don't go to a board meeting and declare I've committed fraud. That just generally doesn't happen. So not necessarily bad things, and they are everywhere. What we have to consider is what is bad is if we don't declare them and the board do not manage them properly. That's when it's bad. Okay. We have two areas here. We have the area of a conflict of interest or a conflict of duty. The conflict of interest is where you have what's called this material personal interest. So this is where a director may be receiving, or some connection to that director may be receiving some form of benefit. It might be to a spouse, it might be to a family member, it might be to a cousin, it might be to a friend, through their position on the board. In other words, they're unable to exercise their judgment independently. Okay, a conflict of duty is where you're a director on one board, or you are a director or an officer of another board, so you may be employed by another organisation, and then due to the fact that you have those two interests, you may not be able to bring that proper judgment to either organisation. And as such, you cannot act in good faith and in the best interests of both organisations. So that's a conflict of duty. And that's becoming an increasingly common area, because we find many people, once they're on one board, they're often asked to go onto multiple boards. And the nature of charities and not-for-profits is that the board are made up of volunteers. And of course, they have other interests and they're employed by other people. They're doing other things. Very few directors are solely, spend their whole entire life on one board. In fact, that is all they do. They have no other job. They have no other interest. They're just on that one board. And so invariably, the issue of conflict of duty abounds all the time. And in the big corporate world of public companies, where we have professional directors paid a lot of money, they're on a lot of boards, many of them, and it's a bit of a joke, I guess, many of them spend more time out of the room than they do in board meetings for this reason. All right. A material personal interest, let's be clear on this term. A material personal interest is one that could eventuate into a conflict of interest. And the key words are material and personal there, okay? So material, what does that mean? How do we determine, is it material? It's nothing, it's really nothing. Or no, it is substantial. How do we determine this definition of material? Which brings this question, how do I know if I have a conflict of interest? Not a question that people ask us, but a question that we're posing here today. How do I know if I have a conflict of interest? Firstly, a personal interest is considered material if somehow it impacts your ability to discharge your duties as a director, okay? And your duties include to act for proper purpose, to act for loyalty and good faith, and at all times for the interest of the association or the organisation. So if you have an interest that makes you think, I can't actually complete that, I can't actually complete those duties, then you need to speak up, okay? As soon as you have an inkling that you may have a conflict of interest, then you must speak up as soon as practical. If you're becoming aware or aware of the potential of such arising, you have to speak up, okay? You can't sit there yourself and make your own judgment on this, okay? you can't, you have to have this debated by unconflicted directors as to the materiality of the conflict of interest and what actions need to be taken. It is not up to you to say, sit at home and say, oh, I don't have a conflict of interest. Therefore, I'm not going to declare it. I'm not going to tell anybody. Okay. It's not up to you to make that judgment. It is up to the other directors. And sometimes other directors have the same conflict. The issue comes up and there might be one or two other directors have exactly the same issue. So it is those that are unconflicted that then have to debate and discuss and decide, does the MPI exist? Okay. It cannot be overstated. If you take nothing else away from this webinar today, it cannot be overstated the importance of disclosing an MPI as soon as possible, and that when you disclose it, that coming forward about that MPI and what the board has done about it is recorded in the minutes. Remember, the minutes are a legal document. Okay, so it's very important that we get explicit around conflicts of interest when we deal with the minutes. Some people come to us and say, okay, great. Is there a list of MPIs? No, there is not. There is not a list of MPIs. And people come to me and say, can you give us a definitive list? And the problem with doing that is, you know, this is situational based, it's scenario based, and it's almost impossible to document every single possible circumstance or issue that could effectively be a conflict of interest. And when people ask for a list and when boards want a list, there is the danger that they'll sort of refer to this list and say, oh, it's not on the list. Either as an individual looks at the list and says, oh, that's not on the list, I'm okay. Or the board looks at it and says, oh, no, it's not on our list of MPIs. Therefore, we don't have to deal with it. And that's a very dangerous situation to be in. So I put some up here on the screen just to give some insight for those that perhaps haven't been exposed as much to the types of things that constitute a conflict of interest. But, you know, the emphasis here is do not have such a thing and do not rely on such a thing. It's a very dangerous area to be in because, again, over time, this list will become sort of, this is the rules. Anything that's not on that list is okay. And that is not the message from this webinar today. So just some quick things, very obvious ones, if you like. Directors proposing, discussing, voting on the decision to employ an employee where that employee is a relative or a friend of a director. That's a very common one in charities and not-for-profits. Very, very common. And that doesn't mean you can't employ those people. Don't get me wrong. What it means, though, you have to declare that relationship and the board has to determine what actions to be taken. Does the action say, okay, you can't be involved in this discussion of this appointment, you can't be in the room, you can't vote? There's a range of different things that can be done. So, yeah, that's a very common one. You know, another one is, you know, where the board is voting on awarding a contract to an organisation. That organisation has some connection to a director, either a relative owns it or a friend of the director owns it or is employed or is the CEO of that organisation. Same sorts of thing. And what the board needs to do is say, well, is this is this circumstance material enough to be a conflict of interest? And if so, what action do we need to take? Again, the action could be, okay, we're happy for you. We want your insight into this. We understand you've made your declaration. Happy for you to continue as, you know, discussing this particular issue in the board, all the way through to, no, you'll have to leave the room and not vote on that issue. Here we have some of the conflict of duties, is where a director is appointed to another not-for-profit board that operates in competition to the first board. Again, they're just some of the samples of conflicts of interest that could be out there. Okay, these are perhaps some of the more common ones. But before I leave this screen, I'll emphasize one more time. Do not rely on such a list. Do not have such a list. Okay, it is a dangerous practice to create such a thing and use it as a reference. So most importantly, how do we handle these things? How do we handle MPIs or conflicts of interest? Well, if you're a company limited by guarantee, that's actually fairly well documented for you under the Corporations Act. And in that situation, anybody who has disclosed a material personal interest cannot be in the room while it's discussed. So that's legislated in the Act, okay? The minutes must record when the director left the room and when he returned or she returned to the room for that discussion, okay? That detail in the Corporations Act could be regarded by best practice, and many of the associations Judy and I work with adopt this as best practice, okay? But if you are an association, you do have that, I guess, freedom, if you like, to develop your own practice, okay, in this regard. If you are a company by limited by guarantee, we use that in an example. So let's say Judy has come forward, she's declared a conflict of interest in a matter that's about to be discussed, or an issue that has come up, or a decision that's about to be made. So she then, as per the Corporations Act, she leaves the room. That's documented. The unconflicted directors then debate. Is this disclosure that Judy has made material, and what action should they take? They must also consider, has the director acted in contrary to the organisation's conflict of interest policy? Many organisations don't have it. I recommend all of you have a policy around conflict of interest. If you need one, please talk to myself and Judy and we can assist in putting one together for you. But it should be in there, or it should be in your board charter. If you have one of those, it can often appear in there about the policy around conflicts of interest. So the board must look at that and say, did Judy know about this? Did Judy follow the policy? You know, has she, for example, disclosed this as soon as she knew, or has she been sitting on this for some time? You know, has she disclosed it properly, etc., etc. Okay. Whilst the MPO may be present, and whilst it may be material, it has to be examined as to whether the material personal interest is actually in contrary to the interests of the organisation. So one may exist. Sure, Judy's come forward, she's declared this, and yeah, it's material. But at the end of the day, given the organisation, given its strategies, given its operation, it's actually not going to make any difference anyway. And thank you, Judy, for coming forward. We've documented, we've followed the process, we've documented, but we've decided that it is not actually contrary to the interests of the organisation. Yeah? They also look at, or should look at, is this applicable to other directors sitting in the room here? Does the same issue apply? And quite often it does. You know, a common scenario of conflicts of interest popping up is the debate for a charity to become DGR status, because many of those directors have previously donated money to the organisation, in which case they may receive a tax benefit if the company achieves DGR status. But at the end of the day, is that contrary to the interests of the organisation? Perhaps not. And it is also something that is equally applicable across many people in the organisation, including other directors. Some of the actions the unconflicted directors can determine, can make a decision to take, include, is the director allowed to be part of the discussions on the matter? Is the director allowed to be in the room for future discussion? So you may decide, the director, Judy, you can't discuss it, but we'll let you stay in the room when we do discuss it. Is the director allowed to vote regarding the matter? These are all options for the unconflicted directors to make and a decision for the board to make about how this is dealt with. Okay. In very extreme circumstances, okay, there may be no other alternative. It might be that big a conflict of interest that the director must resign from the board. Okay. Particularly if the director has been appointed to an organisation that is clearly a direct competitor, then it's very hard to see a situation where that director perhaps could stay on the board. Okay. Because you're sharing strategies and confidential information, and even in your head, you know, it's very hard to accept that that, you know, you can actually be on the board of two very, you know, quite direct competitors. Okay, but they're extreme circumstances. So the process is the director declares. If you're following the Corporations Act, the director leaves the room. Unconflicted directors then debate and discuss, is it material? Doesn't matter. Okay, and all this is documented, by the way. And then what actions are we going to take? You know, is this in contrary to the interests of the organisation? And therefore, what decisions are we going to take? Can we allow this director to take part, or do we just don't want them anywhere in the room for this discussion? We don't want them to vote. What action do we take on that? Okay. And most importantly, that this entire process and the actions be documented in the minutes. And this is an area, and we'll talk about minutes next year, but this is an area where you do have to be somewhat explicit about what went on. Tips for managing MPIs. And this is tips personally and also tips for the board as well. If in doubt, declare. Even the slimmest inkling that I might not be able to discharge my duties of loyalty and good faith to act in the best interest of the organisation, if there's a slim doubt of that, then declare it. It's not bad that you have one. As we said, conflict of interest aren't necessarily bad. In fact, most of them aren't bad. What's bad is if you don't declare it. That's when it's bad. That's when it gets ugly. Okay. Disclose early. Okay. Again, same as if in doubt, declare. You know, do that as early as possible. Get it on the table. Get it discussed. Okay. You'll feel better, because quite often these things sit there and nag away at you. And if they're nagging away at you and you've got this sort of feeling of doubt or whatever, that's probably a good sign that, you know, it is going to be a problem. Develop a conflict of interest policy. That can go from conflict of interest with regard to the board and cover conflicts of duties and such, and how this is handled. It can also then go further into the organisation to expand to be, you know, company-wide policy, not just applicable to the board. Many organisations don't, but they should put conflicts of interest at the start of the meeting on the agenda. And many times this is referenced in a constitution as well. We can go back to the constitution and also start to talk about how conflicts of interest are managed. And you can put detail in there if you want, but certainly put it on the agenda and then have it minuted each meeting for anybody who declares a conflict of interest, or perhaps that there are no declarations. In a kind of related issue, all directors and officers should regularly complete a related parties declaration. Again, life changes. We move into different organisations, we go onto different boards, we take different jobs, etc. And it's an important aspect, and I'm sure Judy will agree here, you know, being an auditor, that this is something that gets audited, is regularly. Directors and officers, so the senior managers, should make a declaration citing all those organisations they are involved with, whether they're a director of it, whether an employee, or whether they have a contract, or whatever it may be. Okay. Most importantly, document in the meeting minutes any disclosures and the actions taken. Okay. Very important. Remember, the minutes are a legal document. Maintain a register. So rather than have to sift through back to minutes of board meetings past, if you had a register there, so lift it off the minutes put it into a spreadsheet or register or something so that you've got that maintained. And that includes, you could put into there the related parties declaration as well. Develop a culture of openness and disclosure on the board. And we'll talk a lot about this next year. It's going to be a theme next year about, you know, how do boards, how do they really operate? Here are the rules. We've talked a lot about the rules and the mechanics of different things, but what's the culture? Is the culture one that when the board is together, when the directors are together, they've got this culture to speak up, you know, talk about it. I can talk about anything in here. I don't have to hold back. And when you've got that culture of openness and disclosure, then people will not be afraid of coming forward with a conflict of interest with an MPI, because they understand it's not a bad thing. And I'm actually executing my duties by coming forward and declaring. Remember to examine on a case-by-case basis by unconflicted directors, okay? Each situation is different, okay? And this is why I emphasize do not have a list, okay? Because they're so different. Remember, that has to be determined by a non-conflicted director. It's not up to you to determine whether you have a conflict of interest. If it's unclear, if it's a complex issue, you're not sure, then do not hesitate as a board or even as an individual to seek independent advice around these, okay? So to summarize, conflicts of interest, conflicts of duty, they're not necessarily bad. In fact, they're everywhere, okay? Particularly in charities and not-for-profits. The nature of our businesses is we connect with people, we connect people from all sorts of walks of life to get the job done. And so many are volunteers, you know, and of course, though, you know, what happens is we end up in this situation where people, you know, are making decisions that, you know, are conflicted or are in positions of conflicted duty. What's bad, though, is if they're not managed early and properly, okay? And that management process starts with the individuals, about them speaking up and declaring early. Even if there's a smidge of doubt, speak up and declare it, get it on the table. And again, a culture within the board that allows that to happen without fear or reprisal, you know, is where you need to be. You should avoid attempting to make your own judgment about whether you have an MPI, and leave that to unconflicted directors to make that determination, okay? Very important. Do not rely on a defined list of examples. Certainly do not put that into a policy or into the charter. Here's all the things that constitute an MPI. Do not do that, okay? That will set up, you know, bad future for you if you do that. Make sure you have a process, and you can follow that's in the Corporations Act, and that dictates that anybody who declares an MPI cannot be in the room while it's discussed, okay? And that can be documented within the policy or within your board charter. And it's vital, if you've declared, okay, I'm speaking up, I've got an MPI, you as an individual, make sure that gets documented. Make sure that gets documented in the minutes. So when you get your minutes back the next month, make sure that you're happy with, you know, what your declaration and the actions and how that was documented. Very important. Very important that it not be just a conversation between you and the chair in the car on the way home, okay? And that the chair saying, it's okay, it's all good, don't worry about it, Jude, it's fine. Okay, make sure these things don't come back to bite you. Make sure these things get documented and are handled properly. Okay, so Judy, discussions, questions, as we said, this is an area both of us deal with all the time with our clients.
Absolutely, and they get very confused about them, I've always found. I've also found that people will confuse a conflict of interest with a related party transaction.
Yep.
And the two to me are rather different creatures. We conduct business with some people on certain boards, also conduct business with the organisation. And that's not really a conflict of interest. That's a related party transaction that would have been pre-approved by the board.
Yep.
Or the executive or the committee, whoever it is. I find the material interest will always vary. What do you think with each organisation because of whatever their actual objectives are?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And this is the point of trying to sort of script these things and put a set of rules around these are the things that constitute a conflict of interest. You can't do it. And, even when we do these training courses in it, each organization is different, has a different set of objectives. And, every single issue of conflict of interest that I've been involved with in debating, particularly from a unconflicted director point of view, has been different and has different angles. And this is the beauty of having unconflicted directors do it, is you've got people coming from different angles on it, putting their own slant on the issue, and it's a really good process to get a thing. But you're exactly right. It is, it's they're different depending on the organisation and depending on the people who are on the board. They're all, coming from different backgrounds, involved in different things, and that creates, a myriad of different scenarios here.
Absolutely. I also agree with you with the fact that it really does need to be documented at every board meeting that there's a conflict. This is our list of conflict of interest that we currently have with our other directors, and directors need to really be open about that. If you're not sure, make the declaration. What's the worst that's going to happen? And I find it interesting that people regard a conflict of interest as a really bad thing. Like it's going to shut the organisation down. Where in actual fact, it's no. We know about it. This is how we're managing it, so it doesn't cause us problems down the line.
Absolutely, and this is the thing. People think they're bad. This is, we started off today, with the question, they're bad, right? Well, no, they're not bad, and don't, because people think they're bad, then they don't want to come forward because they think I'm going to get fired off the board or I'm going to go to jail. People have that in their head. Well, that's not going to happen.
Yeah, which is really, really strange. It's just about, I think I have a conflict of interest. This is what's happening.
Yep.
We're going to walk out of the room, let you guys discuss it. And when we come back in, you guys either decide it is or that it isn't, and that it has to be documented on all the minutes of the meetings.
Yeah. And I think the other point too is that, conflicts of interest. I mean, there are the obvious ones. We put up a couple of examples there. The obvious ones of, employing a relative, or engaging a company that you're a director of,
Mm-hmm.
But there's so many subtle ones, Judy, so many obscure ones, and I use briefly the example of a board debating DGR status. Boards debating, do we go forward and get DGR status? But everybody in the room has donated to the association and stands to get a tax benefit from that. And we're going to pretend that doesn't exist, or we're not joining the dots. That's a conflict of interest. Now, that's also okay, right? But it is something that has to be dealt with. It has to be something that has to be discussed and minuted and that sort of thing. So some of these don't jump out as being obvious sometimes. And, it's this awareness, and I think this culture to say they're not a bad thing. What's a bad thing is if you don't declare it. So.
Absolutely. Because if something does go wrong and you haven't declared it, that's when your organisation is going to have difficulties. And that's when boards tend to fall apart because they're so busy trying to figure out who to blame, or they're not thinking about how to fix it.
Yeah. Yeah. And like the DGR example, like the hiring your son, it might be, your son might be the best person to do that job. And
absolutely.
So
might be completely qualified to do that job and do that role. We just have to tell people.
Exactly. And it might actually be a really good thing for the organisation for Judy's son to be in that role.
Yeah.
And it is not in contrary to the objectives of the organisation. But, in making that appointment, Judy or whoever is the conflicted party needs to, put their hand up, and the board determine how going forward does Judy participate in this decision,
Yeah, absolutely. Like if there's a staffing review, I couldn't review my son's work.
Yep,
His
exactly.
successes and failures. I need to stand down and move away from that and be honest about that.
Yeah. But on the other side of the coin, your son may not be the best person. There may
Exactly.
be better candidates. And it might be quite obvious to everyone, might be a reputational issue. You know, how are we going to deal with the fact that the board hired, you know, one of the director's sons this role when the perception is that that person's probably not the best person. So we have to deal with that, you know, issues of perception and reputation, and you know, was there a fair process in hiring this person? That type of stuff comes up.
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
yeah. And we have to involve upper management in that as well, because there's a lot of upper management talk directly with the board as well. So any conflicts that they have need to also be added to the mix.
and that, you know, that comes back to having a policy. If you had a policy, the first thing you say in the policy is, who's this applicable to? Well, it's applicable to all directors, anybody who's on a subcommittee, and managers, perhaps specifying to a particular level or across the organisation. You know, it might be the CEO, CFO. This is applicable to them as well. You know.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. But again, it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just how we handle it.
Absolutely, it's how you manage it and documenting that you did it. Okay, most important.
Well, thanks for that. That's marvelous. I mean, this is the last one in our series for the 2023 financial year. I see we've got 2024 up, so we'll be able to continue building this for our members and guests to have a look at and come back with some questions, and we can assist them accordingly.
Yep, no, we're getting down into some, you know, technical areas and minutes and different things, and some real soft areas like board mix and effectiveness and decision making, different things that, you know, we've got coming. So yeah, we're looking forward to 2024 and continuing on. So
yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So we'll end.
Good luck everybody in 2024. Have a happy holiday.
Exactly. Cheerio.
See ya.